Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 2nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Larry Hogan, the Senate nominee for Republicans in the state of Maryland in this important 2024 battleground Senate race, a state that is traditionally very Democratic, where elected President Biden back in 2020 by over 25 points across the state, has now found itself at the forefront of national politics in today's discussion with a very competitive Senate race, one that is set up to be one of the more closely watched ones as we head into the November general election season. Now, Maryland recently in the Senate polls right now currently have the Republicans ahead by 6.5%. Now, keep in mind, this is a state where Democrats won in 2020 by 25 percentage points, and the state itself has shown a surprising interest in electing Larry Hogan, the Republican nominee for governor here, for Senate here, who was the former governor who served in this state from 2015 through 2023. Now, the reason why that is happening is because Larry Hogan left office being a very popular Republican. He left office with a very high approval rating, and voters across the state were very pleased at the way he had handled the governorship and handled a very tricky relationship with COVID, President Trump, and then eventually President Biden. But it was in this new announcement that we started to see, some of the dissent from members of the mainstream GOP with Larry Hogan's candidacy for the Republican nominee for Senate. But ultimately, they decided that when Larry Hogan was going to end up running here, they wanted to put aside his feelings about President Trump and the statements that he made about him in 2020 and even 2016, and decided to move forward with this understanding that although he may not be a huge advocate or too pleased with President Trump, he ultimately still is a Republican and serves to be the Republican Party's best chance at winning in a state like Maryland, and based on the numbers today, currently has the advantage. Now, I will caution on my own side and say I do not believe Larry Hogan is at the advantage point right now. But what I do believe is that Democrats and Republicans alike genuinely believe that this Senate race is one of the most competitive and one that deserves a lot of attention and resources in order for Republicans to win. So where does that bring us? Based on the title of this video, I'm talking a lot about abandonment, and it's because in a recent statement from Governor Larry Hogan, he says here that he urges all Americans to respect the verdict and the legal process. And this is a tweet from the official Governor Larry Hogan account that you can see based on reaction, 5 million views, 17,000 likes, and 25,000 responses. And so it's never a good sign, number one, on social media when you are ratioed to this level. When there are 5 million views and 17,000 likes, the ratio here is so far off, and it matters because it shows there is some level of discontent for the statement that he made. And now this statement, despite Governor Larry Hogan likely making it because he knows this is what will work best amongst his constituents, this will work best amongst the Maryland populace, it has now made him enemy number one for members of the Democratic Party already because they didn't want a Republican elected to the U.S. Senate, but now on the Republican side. Laura Trump, who currently is one of the RNC co-chairs, has now said publicly that she pretty much condemns what Larry Hogan has said, saying that he deserves no respect from any member of the Republican Party or any member of the American public. And with that statement was asked, will you still fund Larry Hogan's bid for the Senate race here? She controls the most powerful wing of the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, responsible for any and everything Republican down ballot here. And she declines to say if they will continue to support him after these comments. And so now there's a lot of speculation, because Chris LaSavita, who serves to be as one of the most senior-ranking Trump campaign officials, quote tweeted Larry Hogan's statement and said, "You just ended your campaign." When Larry Hogan made an announcement that he was running for Senate, there was a lot of discontent from the Trump side that brought up the possibility that Donald Trump would endorse a primary challenger. And that's because Donald Trump and Larry Hogan have had problems in the past. Even in 2022, they decided to endorse different people, and Donald Trump's hand-chosen nominee ended up winning the Republican nomination, despite Larry Hogan being the incumbent Republican governor who chose his successor, who didn't even make it through the primary process. And so there was a lot of consideration here that should Donald Trump endorse somebody else in the Maryland Senate primary, it could prevent Larry Hogan from winning the nomination and consequently prevent him from making the general election more competitive. And so the Trump team decided to entirely stay out of it. They didn't make any attacks against Larry Hogan, even though Donald Trump very much disliked Governor Hogan. He refused to endorse in the race because he knew, at least for his, future, if Donald Trump was elected, they'd much rather have a Republican in the Senate from Maryland than any Democrat that would end up being the nominee. Now that is County Executive Angela Alsobrooks. But now, the things seem to be changing. The tide seemed to be turning away from Larry Hogan. especially given now that you have the national RNC chair saying that, Hogan doesn't deserve respect from anyone in the Republican Party at this point, and quite frankly, anybody in America. I mean, these are fighting words from the GOP, fighting words from Trump's senior ranking official in the campaign. And now you're starting to see that all these allies here are signaling they are declaring war against Larry Hogan for these comments on the verdict. And the reason for that is because they wanted a unified front here. We've seen some, conversations about how is the Republican Party responding to Donald Trump's guilty verdict. Well, now they're trying to see him and make him a symbol. Republicans are rallying behind President Trump. They aren't pushing away from somebody who is now a convicted felon in the United States government. They are grabbing onto him and saying, this is our guy. We're not going to back down from a challenge. And so when you have every Republican doing that in all of the competitive states, and arguably to their detriment for the general election season, not enough to say that it's going to entirely sway the outcome of, who wins the balance of power in the House or the Senate, but it certainly is something that if Republicans did in fact have a completely unified front on, arguably speaking, there are areas where that will be, backfire. Biden districts where you have Republican incumbents who are backing President Trump despite the guilty verdict. You have other regions of the country that are swing states, swing districts that you also find Republicans are, backing Donald Trump despite the guilty verdict. But with Larry Hogan's dissent, it fractures the Republican Party, even if it might be the most advantageous move for him as a Republican nominee for governor in a very, very deep blue state. While it might have made political sense on one end, it certainly did not make political sense to anger this side of the aisle, to anger this side of the Republican Party that, quite frankly, didn't even want you to run for Senate in the first place. The only real reason you found that Larry Hogan was courted into running for Senate was not because they liked his conservative leadership or they liked the way he had performed as governor in the state of Maryland. It was entirely about making races more competitive, so Democrats had to divert and spend more money in states like Maryland than they would be able to spend in other battleground states, to take up resources, focus energy and focus of the media, and all of these resources that Democrats have at large. Field offices, volunteer time, principal time. I mean, you're talking about in some ways, should this race get more competitive, maybe we would see the entrance of people like President Biden, who could be campaigning on his own in a battleground state, making a stop in some place like Baltimore or Annapolis or on the outskirts of DC. And so I think that's what the Republican Party's main goal was in doing this, not necessarily because they loved Larry Hogan, but now they hate him. This decision here to speak out essentially in favor of the verdict, saying we need to respect it, clearly angered a very, very core base that Larry Hogan needs to win. And I do believe that this decision to make this statement here did, in fact, negatively impact Larry Hogan's chances at winning. Because he, has room to fall. He needs everything to go for him correctly in order to win the election. He needs his core base. He needs the Republicans. He needs the 2018 voters that voted to reelect him in 2018 despite voting for Democrats down the ballot in the state of Maryland. What we found here in Maryland was that Larry Hogan did well because he knew how to play to his bases. He kept the Maryland Republicans happy, he kept Maryland independents happy, and arguably speaking, based on approval rating polls, kept Maryland Democrats happy. And so that's how he was able to win by 12 points across this state. So when we look at this, and we look at 2018, this is what Republicans might have been able to replicate. But without one part of that, multiple piece puzzle, this entire campaign collapses. It isn't going to go so far as to say that these Trump supporters will vote for Angela Alsobrooks, that they will vote for a Democratic nominee, because that's not going to happen. They simply aren't going to back away from the party that they seemingly now know and love. They're not going to back away from this party of Donald Trump simply because Larry Hogan is on the ballot here. But what they might do is not vote for him. And you also find that it might not even just be a question about who the Trump supporters are going to vote for. Maybe it's a question of who independents might vote for. Because it's not to say that Donald Trump being displeased with Larry Hogan would lose him support amongst independents. I don't think that at all. But what I do think is that there is absolutely going to be negative repercussions, financially speaking, if the RNC does, in fact, refuse to fund this campaign, if the RNC does, in fact, refuse to put in the effort and the time into a race that Republicans at one point in time hyped up to be one of the most competitive in the entire country. And based on where these polls are showing, what they're telling us right now is that Larry Hogan does have a chance at victory. I personally don't agree with this. I never believed that the Senate race in Maryland should have at all been, even labeled as competitive. But it has been. And that's the way that we view it. And that's the way that the numbers are telling it. That's just my personal take. That this race is probably going to go to the Democrats regardless. But I cannot help but explain further that it is a problem for Larry Hogan. Because I could very well be wrong. And Maryland could very well be more competitive than I think. And I think this actually plays into my understanding that eventually a Larry Hogan campaign that was built on the premise of someone who was anti-Trump but kept Trump at bay. I mean, all of these different things here. Larry Hogan was one of the most vocal and outspoken critics of the former president. And so when you make a very tame statement like this one, that was not nearly as supportive of the verdict as any of the Democrats that you see from Maryland, any of the Democrats across the nation, the president's response, President Biden, is who I'm talking about here. And so this was a much more measured and intentional response from Larry Hogan. And it still ended up backfiring. So I think inevitably, we were going to see that Larry Hogan just simply wasn't going to be the one to flip Maryland red. And I think that's, going to be a long-standing problem because there probably aren't that many more Republicans who can appeal to the voters in the state the same way Larry Hogan was able to back in 2018 and back in 2014. But, that's the future of the Republican Party. Laura Trump taking over the RNC solidifies here exactly what we talked about too. When she became the eventual co-chair, we talked a lot about how there may be retributionist actions taken by members of the RNC, firing of people who weren't allegiant to Trump from the very beginning, unwillingness to support candidates that weren't allegiant to Donald Trump from the very beginning, and this is exactly a case of where I think that's going to happen, where this close family personal tie to the Republican nominee for president does damage enough so that these people have blinders on. They're unwilling to recognize that outside of their family bubble, outside of the core MAGA base here, that there is, room for improvement for the Republican Party, room for growth, room for victory that they failed to get in 2018, 2020, and 2022. Republicans have people they can win with. Republicans have people that can at least narrow up races in ways we have not seen Republicans do in some of these states in a very long time. And as I have said in multiple videos before, never, and I mean it, never underestimate the Republican Party's ability to lose despite almost everything working their way in a race. And this is one of those instances where I do believe, too, that Democrats would have been able to win this race regardless. But Larry Hogan was the only one who could make it competitive. He was the only one that did make it competitive when it came down to statewide Senate polls. And so to see now that the Republican Party is not just abandoning him, they are in fact looking like they might even go on the offense against him in the general election season. He has already been nominated for the Republican nominee for Senate. I went through all the different offices there for Senate in this state. And so the idea that Republicans would come out against him would decrease turnout, would decrease the chance at victory, and maybe even you would find that he ends up performing roughly the same as Donald Trump does. Because he does keep some of that independent, more swayable base, but if that core constituency even gets to a consideration where they say, you know what, because Larry Hogan has treated Donald Trump the way that he has treated him, because we are seeing potentially, depending on how they take, declaring war against Larry Hogan, but those are fighting words, if you ask me. Depending on how they do that, you could very well see that there's just a huge dip in terms of voting turnout for Republicans in the Senate race here, because they may think it's more important to not have a rhino in the U.S. Senate than, to have a Republican at all. That it is more important that they defeat someone that was in opposition to one of their, their favorite Republican nominee for president, or somebody that they look up to, somebody that they trust. It really just depends on how voters are taking this. But I do believe there is a core base here on the Republican side that will refuse to vote for Larry Hogan because of statements like this one. And I think you are finding that it is a combination of factors here that now make this state, and my assumption of it, that it was safe blue, even more reaffirmed that this state will, in fact, not be competitive this November election. I think Republicans had high hopes for the state, but ultimately, as I said, it was inevitable that Larry Hogan was going to tick them off in one way or another. And eventually they were going to remove themselves from being responsible for this race, remove themselves from being in a position where they are having to endorse Larry Hogan. I think Donald Trump is at a point, too, where he is angry with any and all Republicans who decide to not back him in this time of need. 34 guilty verdicts. 34 times Donald Trump was found guilty. He is a convicted felon. And so that is a problem for Donald Trump. And when Republicans coalesce around him, and there are very few dissents, a very, very few, Larry Hogan is one of the more notable ones, it becomes very obvious that those are going to be the next people on Donald Trump's hit list. These are the people that Donald Trump is going to want to tank. And I can entirely tell you now, should this go through and this threat not be empty-handed, Larry Hogan will lose the Senate race by even larger than I expected him to a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago. We are talking about him losing by anywhere from 20 to 30 points at that time. Because when you lose that core Republican base, it doesn't matter who you have on the left or who you have in the center. Because Maryland is a Democratic state. Alsobrooks will win regardless. But without that core conservative group, that core Trump base even, Larry Hogan quite literally has no pathway forward in any regard. No way. Zilch. And so that is going to be something that the Hogan campaign now is going to have to do damage control on, maybe get on a call with President Trump, try to do any and everything they can to walk back those words. Because while they might have been right to say on a debate stage in Maryland to the average swing or Democratic voter in the state, it was the wrong thing for his party. And he is now seeing the direct negative impact of abandoning President Trump in their eyes, right? Abandoning him, leaving him out there to dry, whatever it might be. And so the Republicans are, in fact, acting very much in a retributionist fashion, going after Larry Hogan for the things that he said and the things that he did. And it's clear as day as to why that might be. And I think Republicans are going to realize in the future, in hindsight, that decisions like this one are the exact reason why family members of the Republican nominee for president should likely not be running a political party, that in theory, the RNC, the committee there, is supposed to be separate from the Trump campaign, because all of these lines blend. And poor political decisions are made, just like this one, where they're not only now abandoning him in terms of money and resources, but actively considering declaring war against Larry Hogan. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.